Hi guys, welcome to my book review channel. I'm not sure what I should call it. Book baddie does not feel like it actually resonates with myself. I mean, my name is Maddie and that does rhyme with baddie, but that's just like, that's fucking silly. Like that doesn't resonate with who I am. Anyways, welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be talking about Rachel Cusk books. I think I'm going to start with Second Place, and it's definitely different from the Outline series. I would say there's two books by Rachel Cusk that really differ from the Outline series, and this one is Second Place. The other one is Saving Agnes, which I think is her first novel, I'm not sure, and then Parade, which is like her latest novel. And Parade's like probably the most experimental work of hers, but I figured I'm gonna start with Second Place. I don't remember when this was published, but I think this was one of the most recent books by her that I remember, and so I'm gonna explain to you why it's a really great read. So I'm gonna start talking about Second Place. So the premise of Second Place and why I think it's significantly different than the writing style of the Outline trilogy is because there's kind of like there's like more self-present in this, because it's written from the perspective of a woman who lives on a marsh with her husband, and she has this guest house that she invites like artists to come live in, and that's where they'll either do their writing or their painting or whatever their expertise is. And she's like a very like insecure character. She's like an older woman. She has like one daughter, and she's had like a really hard life growing up, and now her husband, he's like a hardworking man, kind of wants her to just feel, you know, at peace and relaxed in her older age, but she kind of feels very, I don't think she feels very seen. I think the relationship she has with her husband is ultimately very like authentic though, and there is like a real love there, but it's kind of like strained throughout like this book. But basically she runs into this artist named Elle and becomes like obsessed with his work. It really like resonates with her on like a spiritual level. And so she invites him over to come stay at the Second Place on her marsh, kind of hoping that maybe he'll paint like a landscape of like the beautiful marsh, or maybe even do a painting of herself. And this book, with all Rachel Cusk books, really talks about like femininity, especially when it comes to like what it means to create as a woman and to be like taken seriously in these spaces. But it's honestly like very interesting, and throughout, like, I don't want to spoil anything, but like throughout Elle's stay, he's not very, in my opinion, he doesn't seem to be like very like grateful for their hospitality. There's a lot of interpersonal conflict like going on in this book, but I think this is beautiful, and I honestly think Rachel Cusk's work is very like borderline philosophical in a lot of ways. So I'm gonna read this like short little paragraph as to why the main character decided to invite Elle to her place, and like what work she saw of his that made him really fall in love with the stuff that he does. So the painting, by the way, was a self-portrait, and it's one of those arresting portraits where he shows himself at about the distance you might keep between yourself and a stranger. He looks almost surprised to see himself. He gives that stranger a glance that is as objective and compassionless as any glance in the street. He's wearing an ordinary kind of plaid shirt, and his hair is brushed back and parted, and despite the coldness of the act of perception, which is a cosmic coldness and loneliness, Jeffers. Also, this is like a letter that she's writing to, I guess this family called like the Jeffers or whatever, kind of explaining like her stay with this very like famous artist. The rendering of those details of the buttoned-up shirt and the brushed hair and the plain features unanimated by recognition is the most human and loving thing in the world. Looking at it, the emotion I felt was pity for myself and for all of us. the kind of wordless pity a mother might feel for her mortal child, who nonetheless she brushes and dresses so tenderly. It gave, you might say, the final touch to my strange, exalted state. I felt myself falling out of the frame I had lived in for years, the frame of human implication in a particular set of circumstances. From that moment, I ceased to be immersed in the story of my own life and became distinct from it. I had read my Freud often enough and could have learned from there how silly it all was, but it took Elle's painting to make me really see it. I saw, in other words, that I was alone, and saw the gift and the burden of that state, which had never truly been revealed to me before. So I think that's like really beautiful, because the act of like perception, to be perceived by others, even when you're like out in the street walking by yourself, there is some coldness to to being perceived, because by strangers especially, but at the same time it's kind of this feeling of being unseen and being unknowable. And that maybe this is because I'm biased by like Buddhism, where it's like we kind of have this narrative, this story that we tell ourselves about what our life is and what gives it meaning and who we are, and it's very egocentric, whereas the true self has nothing to do with, you know, external characteristics such as like, this is my name, this is where I live, this is what I care about. Like really, like the essence of presence in who you are like transcends all of that, and that presence can be found in all living things. And there really is no true self. And I feel like she kind of talks about that. It's like when she looks at Elle's painting, she realizes for the first time, like feels it to be true for the first time, this like letting go of this self that we have internalized to be this like immutable, fixed quality of what it means to be like us, like I, like who am I? When in reality that question doesn't really matter, because the essence of who we are as human beings is like the same, and we share that quality with everyone. And so and also like the cosmic loneliness of it all, where it's like, yes, we know that we are technically all unified and we're all like one, but ultimately we all die alone. And this is gonna sound kind of like silly, but I heard this from someplace else, where it's like, you know, like the family cat or the family pet, it's like when they recognize that it's their time to go and it's time for them to die, they'll separate themselves from the family and they'll crawl underneath the house to like die alone. And even if you're surrounded by loved ones on your deathbed, they can't go to that white light for you. You're gonna have to die by yourself. And so the process of death is the same process of you being born. It's you by yourself. And it's just kind of, of course with like when you're born, you're like ultimately connected to your mother, but still it's like, anyways, I just think this cosmic loneliness and the coldness of being perceived, I think is really beautiful. And then here's also like a second passage that explains her fixation on Elle's work. There's no particular reason on the surface why Elle's work should summon a woman like me, or perhaps any woman, but least of all, surely, a young mother on the brink of rebellion, whose impossible yearnings, moreover, are crystallized in reverse by the aura of absolute freedom his paintings emanate, a freedom elementally and unrepentingly male, down to the last brushstroke. It's a question that begs an answer, and yet there is no clear and satisfying answer, except to say that this aura of male freedom belongs likewise to most representations of the world and of our human experience within it, and that as women we grow accustomed to translating it into something we ourselves can recognize. So yeah, I don't want to like keep reading all of these passages to you, but I feel like I could keep reading forever, because I think all of it is so insightful and piercing and like philosophical. But she's basically craves this like male freedom, this limitless capacity to create and to not be like tied down by like a family that Elle has as like a male artist. And yeah, it's just like so beautiful. And Also, she talks about, this is also a common theme in Rachel Cusk books that also can be harkened back and traced back to Saving Agnes, where the main character, even though she self-identifies as a woman, she always has feelings of like conflict with being a woman and sometimes feels more like male. I hate to like speak in binaries, but I feel like the only criticism I really have of Rachel Cusk's work is that it comes from like a very like white feminist point of view, so there's a lot of, I think it lacks like intersectionality and stuff like that, and some of these sentiments about like female creativity I'm not sure is as relatable today amongst like our generation. But I think Virginia Woolf talks about it a lot, just kind of the limits that are set upon, you know, female creativity, whether it be like painting or writing, in order to be taken seriously. There's kind of has to be like the adoption of like the male ego, and I feel like Rachel Cusk kind of carries that theme into like some of her works. So this is another quote by her. "So we get our dictionaries and we puzzle it out and avoid some of the parts we can't make sense of or understand, and some others we know we're not entitled to, and voila." I'm gonna cut that out. "We participate. It's a case of borrowed finery and sometimes of downright impersonation. And having never felt all that womanly in the first place, I believe the habit of impersonation has gone deeper in me than most, to the extent that some aspects of me do seem in fact to be male. The fact is that I received the clear message from the very beginning that everything would have been better, would have been right, would have been how it ought to be, had I been a boy. Yet I never found any use for that male part, as Elle went on to show me later, in the time I will tell you about." So she has a lot of like conflicting internal feelings in regards to her womanhood, and I feel like sometimes she feels drawn by, or at least like this male energy that Elle exudes in his paintings is very attractive to her because she doesn't have that freedom herself. And yeah, so anyways, Elle goes on to be kind of very cruel towards her throughout like most of his stay there, in my opinion, in subtle ways and not so subtle ways. I don't want to like spoil the book for you and what he does to her that's particularly cruel, but so basically the nature of his paintings changes. He at first like offers to do like a painting of her, which ultimately never happens, or it happened, I'm pretty sure it never happens. And so basically there's this illness that takes over Elle, and it very much changes him, like his persona on like a spiritual level, and it changes the dynamic of their relationship. "I think I understood then that his illness had released from him his own identity and history and memory so violently and verily that he had been able at last to really see. And what he had seen was not death, but unreality. This, I believe, was the discovery he had made, and it was what the night paintings told of. And the question I wish I had asked him that afternoon on the marsh was about what came after that discovery, but perhaps Elle didn't know the answer to that question any more than the rest of us do. Instead, we sat there and watched the birds floating and hovering on the breezes, and after half an hour or more of sitting in silence, I got up while he stayed where he was and seemed inclined to remain. He looked up at me, though, and he gripped my hand suddenly with his own strong, dry, bony hand, and he said, in the same vague, impersonal way, 'I know you're going to feel better soon.' And then at that point, she never sees Elle again. And so I think that he starts doing these like night paintings, which I think maybe they are of the marsh, but all of them are very like dark and they take place at night, and they're very like vague and kind of almost like a portrayal of like the void, I feel like, of the human soul. And this like aspect of unreality is something that can be found in a lot of Rachel Cusk's work, because I think I would highly recommend her books if you experience like disassociation, because the experience of disassociating is commonly talked about in her books. And just like this sense of like unreality that what's going on is like you're kind of like watching a movie of your own life taking place instead of being like an active like participant in your own life. So it's kind of like this this like tragic, bittersweet turn of events where Elle, someone she really looked up to, is kind of, he's suddenly, like, his ego's been stripped away from him because of this illness. He can no longer live independently, and he needs to be like taken care of by people on the marsh. And it's just like this beautiful tale of what it means to be like an older woman and to crave more from life, and you want life to have this great significant meaning, and I think all of us do, no matter what our lives have been like. And yeah. Oh, also I just like flipped to the last page, and I think this is also really good. This one sentence I think is a really good synopsis of honestly all of Rachel Cusk's work, but especially Second Place. True art means seeking to capture the unreal. And I think that is true. Even though Rachel Cusk's work, for the most part, especially like the Outline trilogy, it kind of talks about very mundane things in life, it also shows like the level of detachment that can sometimes happen in your day-to-day life, and this sense of like unreality. And I just think that's very beautiful, just kind of like a disturbing undercurrent of kind of detachment that I think we all feel from time to time in our own lives. But very beautiful, highly recommend A Second Place. And maybe I'll do another video on specifically the Outline trilogy, because I know those books by hers are probably her most popular, and I'll come back with more. Thank you so much for watching.